This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Most welcome on this lovely hot sunny day. You're very good giving up your time. And we also have a very full house online as well, so you're most welcome also. So we have a really important event today in terms of presidency and future of enlargement. It's one obviously that's dear to many people across the Union and more broadly, and certainly will feature for us in our presidency starting next week on the 1st of July. It also came up for discussion when the Institute ran the pre-presidency conference when the European Commissioner for Enlargement, Marta Koss, was a speaker. So we're really pleased today to have such excellent speakers joining us. I'll introduce myself first and then I'll introduce the speakers. So my name is Orla Quinn. I'm a board member here in the Institute and I'm to take up interim director of the Institute next week. So I'm looking forward to an interesting few months ahead. I'm a former Secretary General of the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment. And this will be my third presidency in a different guise. So it's obviously a hugely important time for Ireland in the coming 6 months. So our speakers today, if I can briefly introduce, we have Dr. Fabian Zuleeg, who's the Chief Executive of the European Policy Centre. And Fabian is, and let me just make sure I get it right, Fabian, you're director since 2013 and you have been involved in European affairs for a lot longer than that. You're chief economist there and you've been an analyst and a policy commentator for many, many years. So Fabian, we're delighted to have you joining us. Brigid Laffan may well be known to many of you in the audience. She's the Emeritus Professor at the Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute. Again, former Professor of European Politics at the School of Politics and International Relations in UCD, where she was Vice President. And again, a commentator that we will all be familiar with and a major, I suppose, what I would say, contributor to the European debate over many, many years of her career. And finally, we're joined by Dr. Barry Colfer, who's the Director of Research here in the Institute. And Barry holds a PhD and an MPhil from the Department of Politics and International Studies from Cambridge. And prior to that, he was the Max Weber Fellow at EUI Florence with postdoctoral fellowships in Oxford, Harvard, and the Politecnico di Torino in Italy. So for today, and I'll just lay out briefly the approach we're taking. The event is on the record and we will have a Q&A, which is also on the record. And for the Q&A, those of you who are listening to us online can prepare your questions as we go through the event, and please feel free then to put them through on the Q&A function on the Zoom that you're on. The speakers will speak for about 5 minutes each, and then we will open up for a discussion, which I think the Institute is famous for and is here to support. So for today, just again briefly to comment on it, obviously next week when we take on the presidency, one of the big events on that agenda is EU enlargement. We've seen obviously huge political uncertainty, geopolitical, and arising from that and even more broadly, renewed accession momentum. And a number of countries really, I suppose, demanding and wanting and desiring to join the Union. We had Western Macedonia, the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade here quite recently, and again made a very strong plea for the work that they have already done and their desire to join with the European Union. It's true to say, I think, that the Union is facing strategic, institutional, political challenges, and enlargement is just one of those. But for today, it's obviously a hugely important and delicate subject, which the presidency will work through over the next 6 months. So I'm going to ask each speaker to give us about 5 minutes, roughly, on each of on the topic, and then, as I say, we'll open it up. So maybe Fabian, can I call on you first, please? You're most welcome.
So thank you very much for inviting me. It's a bit of respite from the heat in Brussels. This is very, very nice and cool. Brussels is hitting 40 degrees today. So just to say, this is rather nicer. Also, thank you very much to the IIEA. We have been in the EPC running what we have called Project Presidency for a number of years, where we have cooperation with a think tank during the presidency. We're very glad that we have the possibility to partner with the Institute. So we'll have this event, but we'll also have an event in Brussels, an online exchange. So very glad that we can do that. Turning to enlargement, I think it's obvious that there is a lot more momentum in the enlargement debate. The enlargement debate was stuck for a very long time. If you exclude Croatia, stuck for even longer, and Croatia was what was seen as an easy one to do, rather than some of the other Western Balkans, which were more difficult. But we now have momentum because very clearly, I think, because of the geopolitics in which we find ourselves in. Enlargement is no longer about enlargement. It is about the wider landscape. It is about what this means for security, what this means for our place in the world. And that's why we are also seeing that there's movement in all the different geographic areas of enlargement. In the north, it looks like Iceland is going to open negotiations. We're still waiting for the vote there. But I actually think it is very likely that they will not only open negotiations, but that they will become a member. The shock of Greenland sits deep. If you're next to Greenland, you have to rethink where you belong. I think we are having a very interesting debate below the surface in Norway, where there's a lot of resistance among the population, but among politicians, among other stakeholders, there is a very strong conclusion that Norway has to become a member of the European Union, again, driven by security more than anything else. I think we are having a very interesting debate in the UK. For my sins, I've done Brexit for far too long.
Here.
We all have. But I do think that actually, and I wouldn't have said this a couple of years ago, but I think we are actually moving in the direction of rejoin. It's very hard to see what other solution might make sense. And maybe we have to go through a Nigel Farage government before people realize. But I think the long-term trajectory also there is it makes little sense to be outside when you're facing the kind of challenges we face now. In the Western Balkans, we have a number of countries which should become members relatively soon. Montenegro clearly being the front runner. I think we have to be very careful that this is not a fig leaf behind which we can hide, because Montenegro is not a problem. It should be the easiest thing we can do. But we actually need to make much more progress on the other countries. We also have to decide how we deal with countries like Serbia, whether we continue to pretend that they are just a normal accession countries, or whether we take a much more principled stance on whether countries which do not share our principles can be considered as candidate countries or not. I would personally believe that we would benefit from a clearer line, not only with Serbia, but clearly that's one of the examples. Talking about countries not necessarily sharing our principles, there's of course Turkey, which has been in the waiting room for enlargement for an extraordinary amount of time. Whatever we might have thought in the past, where I think we missed an opportunity, but at this current moment in time, we have settled down into a political game where we pretend that we want them and they pretend that they want to join, neither of which really believes in this, neither of which sees any realistic prospect of Turkey joining in any reasonable time frame. Many other countries will join the European Union before Turkey, so we need to start talking about what other relationship we can have, because Turkey is an incredibly important country regionally as one of the middle powers. So we need to have a different approach than seeing it through the enlargement lens. Moving on, I think, of course, we have Ukraine and Moldova. Ukraine, and this is a very categorical statement, but Ukraine has to be in the European Union within a very short period of time. All of our security depends on it. For anyone who doesn't believe this, you just need to take a map. Look at the Eastern Front. Russia will remain a threat for a very long time. And if you look at the eastern border of the European Union, we cannot defend ourselves against Russia without Ukraine. And we cannot rely on NATO because Ukraine will not be part of NATO. So Ukraine will have to be a part of the European Union, whichever way we're going to manage, whatever exceptions we have to put in. But the final goal should not be in question. And that's not for 10 years, 20 years. It is within the time frame, I would say, of the next 5 years, because when you look at the military estimates, Russia is going to be ready for a broader aggression again, about 5 years after the conflict in Ukraine freezes at the current state. So within that period, we have to be able to put Ukraine into the European Union. We also have to decide how we deal with the Caucasus, which we are ignoring a bit because it's very difficult. We have to be a bit more honest that we are not willing to confront Russia in the Caucasus, which means we should also not make promises to people there, which we have no intention of keeping. Russia considers the Caucasus as its territory. It will not allow the countries to join the European Union. If we are not willing to put the resources in, and that also means thinking about what this means in hard power, then we should be very careful about what we promise. I think interestingly enough, we even now have a discussion in Canada. The majority of Canadians seem to believe that they belong in the European Union. And it sounds funny, but actually there's something behind this, which I think we should take very seriously. And that's the remarks of Mark Carney about middle powers working together, finding new ways of cooperating. I don't think it will mean Canadian membership. That seems a little far-fetched. But that we find ways to much deeper integrate also with countries which share common principles, common values, but are not in the European Union, I think is a necessity. In many areas, we will have to do things through coalitions of the willing, rather than relying on the unity of 27 28, 30, 35 members within the European Union. And I'll finish there. Brings me to the final point, which is the part of the enlargement debate which continues not to be a public debate. And some colleagues of mine have written extensively on this. They called it the test of times. You cannot think about enlargement without thinking about reform of the European Union. Those two have to be brought together. But in the current debate, it is not a serious debate about how we change the Union to make an enlargement like that work, which also means that despite all the rhetoric, despite all the signs which are given, the reality is still that a number of member states are not serious about the big enlargements, not the minor Montenegro, but the real enlargements, and that we continue to promise something which we probably will not keep. And that will put us in an even worse position geopolitically.
Thank you, Fabian. Very good overview and summary of all the obviously the eager people waiting to join and just your perspective on where they are. Brigid, can I turn to you now, please?
So can I make 3 points about the EU's experience of enlargement? Firstly, enlargement is not something that happens to the EU. It is intrinsic to the dynamic of European integration. The enlargement, the EU is an open system. Its treaties allowed for, made provision for the accession of states. Secondly, it's not a rich country club. Most enlargements since the last Nordic Austrian enlargement have brought in countries that were poorer with much weaker state capacity than the existing envoyeur of the EU. And the EU struggled to deal with this, but managed. And then the third thing I would say is all countries join the EU before they're quite ready and before the EU is quite ready. But the member states that join have to be ready enough, and the EU has to be capable of absorbing and continuing to be an effective entity. And that's the trickiest, in my view, issue for this enlargement, because we've already had scale, 27 member states, and the next leap, there are 9 candidate countries, if 6 get in, we're still talking about a 30 plus EU, and there will be a 30 plus. So how the EU can continue to effectively govern itself, but also be a player in a much tougher world, is the big issue of the next enlargement. And of course, the countries like Iceland and Norway that aren't formally candidate countries now, again, are in play, in my view. It's the EU is not ready yet to have the kind of debate that it needs to have on reform. It can deal with Albania and Montenegro in present rules, but it cannot have Ukraine as a member state without tackling deep reform. And the question is, what is that reform? It will certainly require reform across the policy areas, particularly ag and cohesion policy, budget, MFF, and all of that. It will have to use the traditional mechanisms of transition arrangements to smooth the process. But it also needs issues like, and this is the Irish gift to the EU, 1 commissioner per member state. I think that has to be revisited, because what we have now is a commission whereby there is a deep hierarchy in the commission, that there's the president and then the VPs, and then the ones who don't have really. Some have serious jobs and many don't. And I can't see a commission of 35 plus member states. It would be better for smaller, and I know in Ireland that we are, because of the localism of our political system and the idea that we send TDs to the Dáil to take care of our interests. We have some sense that we send commissioners to Brussels. We like the idea of the Irish commissioner. So the big concession was that the large states under existing rules wouldn't automatically have a commissioner. That was a huge give by the large states. So I think that's a very uncomfortable debate ahead, will have to be had. QMV. I think we have so much evidence now that QMV, particularly in foreign policy, is problematic. And the question there is, do you simply have the existing QMV, or do you need reinforced QMV? In other words, you up the percentage both of member states and of population, or do you need a consensus -1 or 2? In other words, usually on foreign policy, it's not a lot of countries. It tends to be smaller numbers. But again, that has to be revisited. And the third issue that, in my view, has to be revisited is, how do we create sufficient safeguards in the system to at least deal with backsliding on the core rule of law and democratic norms? Because we've had the experience of Orban now since 2010. It lasted a very long time. It was deeply problematic for the EU. The good news is that the experience with Orban tells us that you can't, if you're a member state of the EU, become a closed authoritarian system. There is always an opening for opposition, but whether the opposition can break through, of course, is a matter of domestic politics. But we need those accession agreements have got to be much tougher on corruption, on rule of law, and on basic democratic norms and values. There is a deeper question, because I do think the member states so they're not using any of the passerelle clauses available in Lisbon, because it requires unanimity to do that. Is it possible for us, even in an EU, let's say, of 29, to get a consensus on the next iteration of the European treaties? And if we get it, is it possible to ratify? And if we look across, and that's the other point I want to make, is even if we get to agreement on accession treaties for multiple countries, the domestic politics of the existing member states, we could have accidents. The French are committed, for example, to having referendums on membership, and you can just see how that's mobilized really easily. And if you have a referendum in one country, the demands for referendums in others. So these, again, it's a much tougher domestic environment, which, as Fabian said, there's got to be not closed debates on enlargement, but open political communication with European electorates, that it is in their interests that this system enlarges. Why do I say that? And I think this is without argument, that Europe is not into wars of choice. Europe wants capable deterrence. It doesn't want to fight wars against people unless war comes to the continent. And even then, the Ukraine war is being fought by the Ukrainians. And if for the EU, the more security there is in those tough areas in the Balkans and what the Russians call the near abroad, the better. And EU membership is not just a market, but it's also a security union. And then finally, I think the EU, there needs to be, and there already is, but more careful analysis of how, particularly for Ukraine, how you ease the path of integration into the EU. And I know Chancellor Merz had his phased integration or association agreement, which is on the one hand deeply problematic, because if I were Ukraine, I would worry that association membership would become the final offer. But it could be that, particularly in Ukraine's case with the war going on, that we need to be more open to more gradual, et cetera, et cetera. But again, that's would require a lot of deep analysis, and also then to look at what is the best pathway forward for Europe. But will the EU enlarge? Absolutely. Will there be 30 plus member states? Absolutely. And I would say that with a high level of certainty. If you remember de Gaulle, he tried very hard to keep the UK out, and in the end he didn't. Of course, the UK decided to exit it, decided in the end to exit itself. But that then leaves the EU also needs to develop relationship, to know how to deal with countries that are not member states and unlikely to become. And Turkey and the UK are the two big states that have to be looked at. Although I would not rule out the British rejoining, but I think on Tuesday we heard very clearly from Ivan Rogers, he doesn't think that that's imminent, and it's not.
Thank you, Brigid.
Many thanks, Brigid, for that. And again, you raise very significant issues for questions or for discussion and for consideration. So our final speaker, Barry, I'll pass over to you.
Thanks a million, Orla. And I think you'll be glad to hear much of what I could say regarding the intrinsic nature of enlargement of the European project, regarding the geostrategic urgency around Ukraine, matters around QMV, and indeed the recent other departure of the UK has all been said. So I don't need to go over that ground. I'll just mention a little bit about the Irish perspective on enlargement, I think. But also we forewent the minute silence to mark the decade, hard to believe, since the UK's withdrawal last week. So just to acknowledge that. I also just want to say, before sharing, I think, only a handful of remarks, to say please we ought to have this partnership or this engagement with EPC, and I hope it's the first of many. So, as many of you will know, because it was well trailered for a year, it was helpfully leaked by Politico and then published by the Irish government earlier on in this month, that the Irish presidency priorities are arranged around three pillars: pillars of competitiveness, pillars of values, and pillars of security. And it's clear that enlargement cuts across the three of these, both literally and philosophically. You can see how central the enlargement mission is to the Irish government project, but indeed specifically to the presidency. I think there's a real sincerity in Ireland around that. I think there's a real meaningful understanding at the political level that another European democracy should be afforded the same opportunities that we were. And that Ireland is, I think, very fairly set out as one of the best case studies of successful enlargement, coming in the 70s as an agrarian, unprogressive country to now one of the most successful, prosperous countries in the world. So I think the point I'm making is that I think the attachment to enlargement is sincere and goes beyond the rhetorical. Indeed, if you listen to our Minister for Europe, Thomas Byrne, I think is someone who is really well chosen for that role. He has a very sincere attachment himself to enlargement. He speaks about having spent time in Moldova, and I've quoted him saying some of the most important democrats in Europe go to bed and go to work in Moldova, for example. So it goes beyond just the interests of the enlargement countries or the aspiring membership countries. It's also in terms of safeguarding the kind of European way of life, and I think that's really sincerely held. It's also probably easier in 2026 to be pro-enlargement from this part of the bloc on the Atlantic fringe. But I would also say that if you go back as far as the 2004 enlargement, it was only ourselves, the Swedes, and the UK that had no kind of transitional measures for inward migration. So it goes beyond the kind of rhetorical to the practical, the attachment here we have towards enlargement. Maybe two or three other points to make, and I'll do them briefly. I think domestically, one of the reasons why enlargement is so centered, in the Irish presidency is there's a bit of diplomatic signaling happening around Ukraine, that Ireland is providing enormous support for Ukraine in terms of money, in terms of refuge, in terms of training for its military. But there's also probably a bit of an insecurity about perceived deficits given Ireland's peculiar relationship, given that we're a neutral country and we can support Ukraine with non-lethal equipment and not lethal equipment, for example, for its war. So I think one of the reasons why Ireland are so vocal in its support for Ukrainian enlargement is partly explained by that. So it's both, again, I'll try not to use the word repeatedly, I'll find a synonym for sincere. I think it's both sincere, but also partly signaling to its European peers that it's really committed to Ukrainian membership. I'm going to mention one thing which Fabian and Brigid both mentioned, and it's about the kind of thorny issue of institutional reform. For me, I'm afraid it does feel inevitable that there will be some kind of transitional membership offered to Ukraine, fully agreeing with what I think Fabian said, or perhaps it was Brigid, that if I need to be clear now, divorcing what I think I would like to happen and what I think will happen. And if I was in Ukraine, I would be extremely sensitive to this, because it could be a Hotel California that you're in the waiting room forever. But it just feels, because it was well trailered by Brigid, I think all of the veto points that are available now to further enlargement, just the Herculean challenge it would involve to get everybody on side, domestically, regionally in some member states, is just so enormous. And it reminds me of that cliche, or the metaphor rather, from the Eurozone crisis, when I think it was President Juncker spoke about the plane, but the plane was crashing and you're trying to fix the plane whilst you're crashing out of the sky. And I kind of feel with respect to the Eurozone, I kind of feel similarly that the urgency of Ukraine being brought within the European family and the European auspices is so urgent that I would be willing to foresee some kind of transitional measure to avoid it being thwarted by a referendum in France, a referendum here, a referendum in Wallonia, wherever it might be. My final 2 points, or I'll make them briefly, and it's just 2 quick points of healthy disagreements. One is regarding the UK. I also have great interest in British politics, and I would, similar to what I said about Ukraine, I'd love to see the UK rejoin. I think it'd be good for them, good for us. One of the great democracies, a great Atlanticist country. I just don't see it, given the kind of we're watching in real time the UK populace coming to terms with an ordinary fragmented political environment with more than 2 parties. And I think just the political context there is too difficult to envision the UK rejoining. There's also the kind of sticky point of the pound. They love the king, they love their stamps, they love the pound. So the idea of giving up the currency, I think, will be a step too far, and that will be a requirement for any future member, as you well know. So I would also just the point to make here is regarding, you mentioned Canada, you mentioned Turkey, you mentioned the UK, you mentioned Norway, you mentioned really good democracies in our midst and on our borders, but also further away as well. Some form of further meaningful engagement with these countries, I think, is what is pragmatically more likely to happen in the UK rejoining. And finally, I'll just say to Brigid, and it's very rare that I disagree with something Brigid says, but when I think back to the trauma of the Lisbon Treaty, and if you talk about the trauma of the losing a commissioner or having a commissioner 2 times out of 3, I really think that is a price worth paying. And I really think there is a public administration and political way of doing that. But I think by that, I'm talking about having a senior minister, a senior commissioner 2 times out of 3, and a junior commissioner 1 time out of 3, or whatever the stitch up might be. And you're right as well to say there's a couple of commissioners, I don't even know what they do or really what their responsibilities are. The problem is that isn't stated bluntly. I think if there was a mechanism or an understanding that every member state, 2 times out of 3, you get a proper commissioner, 1 time out of 3, you get a junior commissioner, I think that's fine. Like, we have cabinets around the 27 who have dozens and dozens of ministers, but you have your senior ministers playing senior hurling and your junior ministers playing junior hurling. And that's how I would, to end on a jaded Irish metaphor, that's why I would like to see the Commission work in future. Thanks, Orla.
Thank you very much, Barry. Again, bringing through a lot of issues raised there. Fabian, did you want to come in on something there before I open it up to the floor?
I just wanted to make one point, but I also have to react to the UK. I think one of the things which this current environment brings with it is that things happen which we don't think are possible. And I would just point to the example of Denmark. Danish European policies are completely the opposite of what they were before Greenland. So I think we are going to see those kind of seismic shifts. And I'm just saying, I think it is possible that it will affect the UK in a similar way, but maybe not in the near future. I think we're talking about a longer time frame. But the other point I just wanted to make, and that does apply to Ireland, but it applies to every country in Europe at the moment, we're having a very strange debate, because you will hear this kind of debate about strategic considerations, about geopolitics, about what we need to do, at the same time as we're having a debate around the multi-annual financial framework, where every country is going into the rabbit hole of how much can I get out of this? How can I reduce the amount of money which goes to other people? How can I sell any of this at home? And when you look at the current discussions around the MFF, enlargement is not a feature. There is nothing in the current discussion which finances the necessities of enlargement. So it's even in that very, very fruitless debate which we're having around the MFF, we're not even acknowledging that there will have to be an enlargement in the near future.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.